Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our weekly Wednesday webcast. On behalf of the Montessori Foundation and the International Montessori Council, I welcome you today for yet another conversation, another presentation on always topics of interest to Montessori school leaders and educators. Today we have with us Dr. Cindy Acker, who will be our lead presenter. Cindy has an extensive background and she may want to tell you more about that. She also is the head of school of the Child Unique School in Alameda, California. Cindy also is leading our IMC task force on social justice, and so she has come up with a topic for today to help us get started on that and continue that conversation and that learning. I'm also joined today by her colleague, Sarah LaValle. And Sarah, I don't know your exact title, but I think it's Equity Coordinator. Is that right?
It's a grand title. It's a Director of Social Justice.
Oh, that's even, okay, Director of Social
Justice. Grand title.
Thank you. And Sarah also has been working alongside Cindy and helping with projects at IMC and the Montessori Foundation. So thanks for being here today, Sarah. And then we have our Montessori Foundation staff and consultants. We have Jonathan Wolf with us, Senior Consultant with the Montessori Foundation and IMC board member. And we have Tanya Reiskind, Associate Head of School at the Newgate School, our lab school in Sarasota, Florida. And additionally, we have Tim Selden, founder of the Montessori Foundation, chair of the IMC. And we are so happy to be together today. We have several other people. We have quite a few people continuing to log on. And we want to remind everyone that we are recording today's broadcast. First of all, we'll be posting that both in the IMC member area of the Montessori.org website, as well as in the Montessori Foundation's YouTube and Conversations Facebook group. So there's multiple places that you can find today's recording. Additionally, we would love to hear your questions, comments, and those will be posted. You can post in your question box on the control panel. So on the right-hand side of your screen generally is a GoToWebinar control panel. About halfway down, you'll see the question tab. If you click on that, it'll open up and you can write in there. And my colleagues, Tim and Tanya, will be monitoring that question box and either responding to you directly or, more importantly, bringing the questions to Cindy today so that we can address them in real time. So everyone, thank you so much for doing this, and I'm looking forward to this myself. So Cindy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Kathy. I decided to give you a topic that sounds like it would be really frightening, but I thought that it was really important that we could start at the beginning. After we've had these conversations that have this past week that have had to do with racism and the need for us to do our work, that if in fact we're really going to do our work, then we probably should start at the beginning of education and racism, because that's our field. So I'm going to have Sarah show you a little piece that is a part of the CGMS Leadership Series, but I will bring you up to speed before we start the video. So when America first had its history in colonization, in 1635, the first school happened in the colonies, and it was a school. By 1647, there was one school for every 100 families. And then in the 1700s, Thomas Jefferson set up a two-track educational system, one for laborers and one for learned people. And so from its inception, education was something that was designed for the elite, for people who were white, for people who were already privileged, and it was not available to anyone else. And then in and I should also say that at that time, education also was male-centered. And so originally they didn't feel that it was important for for women to become educated, for girls to become educated. And so it was white males that were the beginnings of domination in America. Rianne Eisler talks about that kind of domination mentality a lot in her books, and we see that having flowed through education. And so when there became any kind of education, there was a free school that ended up being developed for the wealthy, and it became illegal in 1830 for any Blacks to be educated. And so around that time and after that time, if there was any slave who attempted to learn how to read or to learn how to write, they were either beaten or they were killed. Because it was important at that time that education was a process to only assist those who were elite and who were white, and a process of exploiting other people by denying them the ability to educate. They couldn't congregate unless it was granted. They couldn't read, they couldn't write, and all of that was held down. Slaves were held down for not allowing them the ability to educate. So Sarah, can you? We have a little bit of feedback, it looks like.
Yeah, I'm not sure why there's feedback, but I wonder. You want me to start the video?
Kathy, shall we have everybody mute and then Sarah
Yeah,
start the video?
so we're going to all mute to make sure that we're limiting that feedback.
Look at that, and when you are concerned about that, where it began in public school, you can thank Horace Mann. That's where it began. And then 1848, history and education meld again. And I think that we can look at many historical events and then juxtapose them against education and see how one affected the other. This is a major example. So the war against Mexico ends with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which gives the United States almost half of what used to be Mexico. The treaty guarantees the continued use of the Spanish language, including in education. And it's interesting because that has been an issue that has been battled back and forth through the school system as to whether or not students could have their language of their birth and whether or not foreign language should be included within education. Well, here we go. This was a treaty signed at the time that the United States took over part of Mexico that guaranteed that Spanish would continue to be used in schools and that it would continue to be used as a part of language. 150 years later, 1998, California breaks that treaty by passing Proposition 227, which makes it illegal for teachers to speak Spanish in public schools. Something else happened that has become the subject of great controversy between public education and alternative education. 1851 just started this series of events that shows how the government started to act in regards to education and discrimination. In 1851, the state of Massachusetts passed its first compulsory education law. Sounds good, but the goal behind it was to ensure that poor immigrants were civilized, is what it says, to allow them to become good workers, and that they learn obedience and restraint so that they could be controlled by the people who they were working for. And then 1864, Congress makes it illegal for Native Americans to be taught in their native language. And children as young as 4 began to be taken from their parents and sent to the Bureau of Indian Affairs off-reservation boarding schools. Their goal was to kill out the Indian to save the human being that would be left over. And then from 1865 to 1877, there was this historical marker that happened with African Americans who began to mobilize to bring public education to the South for the very first time. After the Civil War and after the end of slavery, the legal end of slavery, African Americans in the South made alliances with white Republicans to push for a lot of political changes, which included rewriting state constitutions to guarantee free public education for African Americans. And then comes the end of Reconstruction. And when that happened, whites regained political control of the South and laid foundations for legal segregation. And that brings us to the end of 1896 and a very historical piece of education. It's Plessy versus Ferguson. It's where the Supreme Court rules that the state of Louisiana had the right to require separate but equal railroad cars for blacks and whites. This decision meant that the federal government officially recognized segregation as being legal. One result of that was that Southern states were allowed to pass laws that required segregation in public schools. Classrooms were not only separate, but they were far from equal. Classrooms were cramped and facilities were poor maintained for students of color. Course materials were outdated, extracurricular information and activities were non-existent. Teachers who taught children of color were often underqualified and spread too thin to allow their education to even be effective. That brings us to the 1900s. And in the 1900s, in 1905, the US Supreme Court required California to extend public education to children of Chinese immigrants. No, it wasn't allowed for them before that. And there's another mark. From 1950 to 1960, enter the NAACP, who brings in a number of lawsuits over unequal teachers' pay for blacks and whites in southern states. At the same time, southern states realized that they were starting to lose African American labor to northern cities. So these two sources of pressure resulted in an increase of spending on black schools in the South because they needed to be able to have their people in order to work. So then the courts entered into a battle with Brown versus the Board of Education. The Supreme Court unanimously agreed that segregated schools are inherently unequal and that they must be abolished. This became a major piece in history because there were many parents who were outraged, many people in the community who were outraged, and there are videos and pictures of police lined up in front of public schools where children of color were entering that day, African American children, and the police had to be there to allow them entrance because of the upset of the white community. But interestingly, almost 45 years later, in 1998, there are still some schools that continue to practice segregation in one way or another. There are proms that are segregated proms in the South and other ways of segregating children that underneath the cover, people would think everything is fine, and yet there's still segregation going on in school.
There you go,
Thank you,
Cindy.
Sarah. I hope you were able to listen, even though the picture was sounding a little odd. I think that the thing that is really important for us as Montessorians to recognize in understanding why there is this issue that has to do with racism in education is that from its very inception, it was biased and it was racist. From its very inception, the whole reason behind education was to assist white people to get better and to achieve, and consequently, it was also a tool that was used to hold back people of other races from being able to get anywhere. Schooled for servitude was the expression that was used, that the only reason why blacks needed to have any kind of education was to learn what the orders were, that they were supposed to carry out, and to do that to its fullest. And from that perspective, that there was no other reason for them to become educated. And so when African Americans began to fight for the right to be able to educate, there was even an additional tax that was placed. They were required to pay taxes as everybody else, but there was something called the black tax that was added on to African Americans to fund their own schools. And even when that wasn't allowed to happen anymore, at that point is when schools became very different. White schools and black schools became schools that were defunded, had had inequities in their educational materials, in the facilities. And when Brown versus the Board of Education came and desegregated schools, the ruling was there, but schools still chose not to desegregate. Many people think that it all got better at that point. At that point, what happened is that many schools closed down completely. They shut their doors because they decided that they would prefer to have white students not go to school as opposed to having Black students in school with them. And other schools in North Carolina and South Carolina, they set up separate schools that white families secretly started to put together, and that they just quietly didn't allow other students of color to enter into the schools. And so when we look at that, and we look at that as being the beginnings of education, and we juxtapose that against what we do and who we are and the pedagogy that we follow. To me, I think it's an important piece for us to really look at, to pay attention to our practices, to make sure that we know that there is a long history for African American students who did not have parents who had the same level and the depth of education. And that goes back to their ancestors to be able to teach them in the same way. And we've learned a lot that children have an advantage who have parents who are able to really support them educationally and who have had those tools in life. And so when we look at that, we have to pay attention to what society has already embedded within the stream of things as to how children are educated and how we may accidentally, unconsciously look at the abilities of African American children and other children of color. I remember I have two adopted brothers who were teenagers, and I can remember fighting with the teacher to say, please don't graduate my brothers, because they couldn't read and they were in high school. And when my parent died and I started to take care of them, I didn't realize that they couldn't read. And they were 16 years old with a history of having been sent through school and taught just get a D, because a D will pass. And that is what they got from their educators. And so I had to meet with the principal and teachers to say, please do not graduate my brothers on to the next level, teach them how to read. And I think that it often happens for us that we let go of that history, because embedded within many African American, especially African American males, is this idea that they will fail anyway. And I think it's important that it's a piece that we recognize and that we look differently at what our expectations are, that we look differently across gender, across race, across all of the areas in which we might accidentally and unconsciously discriminate against children in the way that we teach. I also think that it's really critical that we look at the history of the things that we teach and to recognize that we may need to change that up. When we are teaching children about holidays, are we teaching them from the ideological information that we've had growing up and what we've heard, or are we teaching them from what is really true? Are we celebrating things in the classroom? And when we celebrate something in the classroom, we're saying this is the way it should be. And are we colonizing our children in that way? Are we saying to them, this is how it is because this is what is right? And what does that do for the children of a different race or a different religion who have a different form of right in their household? And when we're teaching children about other things that may have a political bent or that may have our own ideological bent, we need to take the time and really question, what were the origins of this practice? What were the origins of these things? And how much care do we need to take as educators so that we don't continue this process of colonizing children, of teaching them that a particular thing is the right and only way, and that they need to be washed into the way that we are thinking because we're presenting it as though it's so. So that's a little bit of information. I'm curious if any of the panelists have any thoughts about that. And then Kathy, perhaps we can open that up to people who might have questions or comments.
Yeah, Cindy, one of the things that someone's asked is, what was the scholarly author that you mentioned? It was probably
Which-
early on.
Oh, I don't know which
Yeah.
one about which thing.
I did. Well,
Or-
Aaron, it was Aaron Lenigan who wrote. Maybe she can give us more context. A question for you though.
Sure.
Many people are saying how much they appreciate that you're giving a historical framework or timeline. And as someone who has really tried to study the history of American education, I appreciate it. And I wonder, what resources do you believe that Montessori educators ought to read that will not only help them to see how the state schools in America were organized to homogenize European immigrants, but to really create a class system and an ethnic bias system for various minorities, most specifically African Americans, but also other groups that were really stigmatized and put in the dummy class or whatever. What would you have? What do you find is really good resources? Because there are not a lot of easy books out there, except in, you know, Afro-American Black Studies programs.
I would say two things. One, I would say don't read anything that is I don't know, maybe 10, 15 years is about Max, where we had much more enlightenment. If you look up any books that have to do with education and colonization, education and race, education and racism, the origins of education and racism, and I could probably provide Kathy with a few books that we can end up sharing out. But those are the subjects that you want to be able to look at. There's an incredible doctoral piece that someone wrote that has to do with the origins of racism and education in America. So it's things like that that are actually going to give us some honest answers. But there's also some really interesting information in the Library of Congress. You can go through the Library of Congress and you can get some of the origins that were just not shared, including narratives of slaves, which is quite amazing. It is the recordings of slaves by someone who was interviewing them, and they recount information about their history. And it's a lot of reading. I mean, it's a lot of listening, and it's difficult because it's old recordings. But it certainly allowed me to put myself into the position of what was going on at the time. And there are different perspectives of slaves, but there are a few of them that touch on slaves and trying to learn how to read and write and things like that.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I have a comment here from Nanette Schoenleber. Nanette says, will this be available for sharing with my colleagues? It is very timely, and I'm so interested in the intersection of colonialism, imperialism, and racism. We aren't talking about this yet in our institution. And so I can answer that, yes, it will be available. We are recording it, and we will be posting it in on the IMC member area of the website, the Montessori Conversations Facebook page, and the Montessori Foundation YouTube channel. So it will be in a variety of places. And, you know, I just want to say that we always have recorded, we always offer these webcasts free to everyone to listen to live. And we've always had the recordings for IMC members. But when we find an exceptionally timely subject like this that we think is essential for as many people to hear as possible, that we do make it publicly available to all Montessorians. So thanks, Cindy, for doing this and for agreeing to share it across all lines in Montessori. So, and any other questions, go ahead and put them in. If she's asking about the name of the speaker, that's Dr. Cindy Acker, A-C-K-E-R. Dr. Cindy Acker is our guest today. and as well as the lead of our task force. So there you go. People need to know your name. It's important.
So I'm curious if the other panelists, including Sarah, if any of this has brought anything up for you.
Well, I spent 3 years. There's feedback.
Yeah, a little bit of echo. Tanya, try again.
So Cindy, you know, we've talked about this, that I actually had the honor and privilege of teaching American school law to superintendents in a community that was highlighted in the New York Times as the last bastion of apartheid. And so bringing to consciousness, you know, institutionalized racism to superintendents 30 and 20 years ago, and trying to guide them in just looking at their policies and what they were trying to accomplish in their school to perpetuate the level of segregation that continued to exist in the community. I think that's where, for me, it hasn't, you know, the history, you say, well, and then 100 years. I don't think people realize how long 100 years is with no change, and how
Yes.
long 400 years is of systemic racism, and how long, you know, and I think that we think in our community, it's kind of like the garbage situation, not in my backyard. It didn't happen in my backyard. You know, my school is fine. You know, we have 5 kids, and I think that conversation has to really flip.
And I'm struck by how little, Cindy, that we, any of us, at any part of our in any part of our education, even at the university level, and certainly even in our Montessori preparation courses, did not learn this. And you know, I get that there's many reasons for it, and I get that we all have a responsibility to educate ourselves about these things. But at the same time, I just think it's unconscionable that we have a public education system that does not teach our teachers or our children, and we have a Montessori educational system that is not systematically teaching this. I very much appreciate that this is a part of the CGMS leadership program, and I very much appreciate that many training programs have taken on, you know, and tried to tackle this issue and bring more of it in. So I am certainly not saying that no one's doing anything, but it's not expected, required, systematized, standardized as an expectation. And I find that really just, I guess, disheartening to a certain extent. And I'm an eternal optimist, so I'm going to be optimistic that we're doing it now and we're going to make the changes that need to be made, particularly at the teacher preparation level, because I really think that's where it starts.
You know, it's interesting to me when you, if you think about sci-fi movies and how they're designed so that you can watch something that's going on and someone's very clever in how they've kept it a secret, and then all of a sudden you discover that the criminal is there and what they're doing. And when I look at this entire history, I think how clever of a design to maintain racism at all levels, not only to use it as a tool to harm, to kill, to separate, to discriminate, but also to use it as a tool of secrecy, because if you don't know what you don't know. And then it will never change as long as the cat is not out of the bag, so to speak. And
Right.
so, I mean, it's amazingly clever, and it puts on us who are becoming woke the responsibility of dismantling something that has gone on for a lifetime. And it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. And so to me, it's like now a lot of us have just not known. A lot of us have not known, but that was also in the design. When you see the fact that there are things that are in history, and there's a lot in historically, there's a lot in spoken word, there's a lot in written word between peoples and between tribes. There are letters from people. I mean, even the movie Hamilton, which opened up the fact that there were politicians and there were slaves and there were people who had children, and a lot of that was kept under wraps. But now we have to just keep learning, and we have to now question everything to say, if we truly want to dismantle racism at its core, then we've got to do some courageous work of really looking at all of the things that we do, all of the things that we have learned and grew up with, and all of the things that we teach other children, because we want to stop it here, and we have the ability to be able to do that.
Thank you. Sarah had something to add. Oh, Sarah might have gotten called away. Oh, you're
No,
muted, Sarah.
there was a microwave going and I couldn't have talked over it, so we've just negotiated it. No worries. I wanted to just call attention to a recent desegregation order right here in Marin County. That these things, it is not gone, it is not done. Through the best of intentions, a school created a system that turned out to be quite segregated. A charter school in Mill Valley, you know, that was partnering with the public school, all of a sudden over the course of years overshadowed it, and the charter school looked fabulous. It looked integrated, it looked diverse, but what it left behind was a school that was 95% African American from the other side of Mill Valley. And they literally, the charter school actually bumped the public school off of its campus, displaced them. And the attorney generals here gave them a desegregation order. And so it's here, and we have to be really looking at our intentions are one thing, but the outcome, what we actually produce, has to be looked at. It's not about just our good intentions. This is, you know, this systemic can be quite deliberate, as Cindy's pointing out, but it can also be inadvertent, and then you just don't want to see it because you like what you've created. You've created something that feels good. And it feels good to some Black kids too. I mean, it's not that school doesn't have its share of a whole plethora of people of color. It just left behind this without even thinking about it. So I just wanted to share that desegregation orders are still occurring when this one just happened.
Yeah, Cindy or Sarah, that's a really interesting point, and I don't know if people recognize and realize that some of the deseg orders from the 60s are still in effect because communities have not complied and continue to be under that same order. And it's a lot of the root of our school choice programs, our school voucher programs, magnet programs, all of that isn't because out of the kindness of people's hearts that they would like to have a more equitable school system, but they're trying to comply with these deseg orders, and they've come up with these creative ways to do it. So, and it hasn't worked yet because there's still communities that are still under those original orders, let alone new orders. So yeah, it's an interesting history. I do have a couple of participant questions that I think really we need to get to. I have Mercedes Castle. Hello, Mercedes. Nice to see you here today. She says, at an institutional level, what would be an appropriate way to integrate the information that we received today into teacher formation? So Mercedes is very involved in teacher education. She has her own program and teaches for other programs as well. And she goes on to say, also, part of that conversation has to be about the resistance of white people to understand the complexities of these systems and our complicity in them. It would be helpful for teacher educators to have support in responding to this. Is there something we can do as an organization to support teacher educators in this as well? Do we have an idea for you, Mercedes?
Kathy, do you want to explain what we're doing?
Well, I just want to, I would like to invite Mercedes to continue to consider serving on the task force for teacher education programs, recommendations for programs and for MACD competencies that would support that direction. And we are already in conversation with MACD about that, and certainly internally at IMC for our programs. So we would love to have you involved, Mercedes, in that. But Cindy, go ahead.
Exactly that. The first thing that we've been doing is just looking at ourselves and looking at what are the things that we can look at systemically. And so you are right. It's really critical that we can address teacher education programs so that we don't roll out teachers who are not racially conscious. That part is really important. And Kathy already made the conversation start with MACD, which I think is really wonderful. And I would say that on a school level, that it's important for heads of schools to look at everything that they do. I was just working with a school in California, and they have very short hours, and they have a very limited homogeneous population. And one of the things that I asked them was, have you always had these particular hours, and why did you begin the school with these particular hours? And they said after a lot of conversation, they discovered that, well, it actually came from the need to leave out parents who were working. They didn't want two working families in their school, to weed out certain types of populations. And so they created their school around nanny hours. When a parent who also had a nanny would just drop in, have the child come for a few hours and go. And so I asked them whether or not they recognized that having done that served the purpose back there and was continuing to serve that purpose, but that the purpose that they had set up was discriminatory, and that they were literally disallowing families who work, and making the assumption that, or making the discriminatory view present that working is wrong, and that people who don't have the money so that they don't have to work, that those people are wrong and didn't deserve an education in a Montessori school. And that within that, it also reflected a particular population, because many people of color do need to work, and that they have, and I'm missing a piece. They also disallowed scholarships or funding of any kind. And so they literally just created for them a bubble of disenfranchisement, so that no one could come into their school except this particular population. And when I shared that with them, it hit hard, because they realized that the entire infrastructure of the school was built based on that. Their hours, the things that they do, how they work with their families, when they have their meetings, all of it was completely based on that. And so it's clearing out the closet. And you know how, if you've ever gone through a period of needing to take it all out before you can reorganize it, it's like that's the depth to which we need to be able to do that in practice.
Thanks. I have a couple of other, let's see, Lulu Camacho. I'm reading a book about raising white children that encourage colorblind and diversity focus be replaced by more racially conscious and aware approach, and explicit instruction. Do you know the book Raising White Kids in a Racially Unjust America by Jennifer Harvey? We've had that one come up before, but I'll let you comment. Do you have recommendations for where a school community should start? With adults, students? What do you think?
I think all school communities need to begin with the educators, with the heads of school and with the educators. First, educating themselves. First, recognizing that they even have biases, and what they look like, and doing that kind of hard work first. It's something that I've asked of the people who are joining the task force. And what I've asked of the IMC is that we first do this work, and that's across the board, regardless of what your race or ethnicity is, because you can't really adequately teach something to children that you don't have. If you don't have it within your vessel, you can't provide it to children, not adequately.
Thank you. And I think that answers several of our questions, I will tell you, because many people are asking, where's the starting place? And I will say, you know, Cindy, you challenged each of us at IMC as we reached out to you that we look at ourselves first and look at then ourselves as an organization and policies and procedures and norms and practices, because not everything's in writing. Some things are just inherent habit, right? And customs. And so there's a lot to look at and explore. And, you know, starting with the educators, I feel the same way, and the heads of school, because if the educators aren't getting the support, you know, from the head of school. So we're answering a lot of the questions just having to do with that. I also will share that. Pardon?
If I can just add a piece, which is that it's a part of the conversation that Kathy and I have had, is that this is a piece that is learning at its core, and that it is not something that you can do in a heartbeat. And so so we need to be able to support that. We need to be able to help people to be able to get that information and to have more things that are available.
Yeah, and you did assign us homework, and our first book assignment was How to Be an Anti-Racist, which is it's back-ordered right now in some places, but we found it on, you know, audio and Kindle and all kinds of formats, and have all started on that process as well. And there is a book list that we have given out before. We'd be happy to post that again. Actually, it is there right now. It's in your handout section at the bottom of the control panel under handouts. If you click on that, the second handout is a book list that Cindy has provided. So that's a good starting point as well. Let's see, I have Maureen Newton. Hi, Maureen. She says, happy day to all you wonderful people. Well, it is a happy day because we get to be with you wonderful people today. I tell you what, the best part of our job, right, is that we get to talk to Montessorians all day long. It's the dream come true. So she says, I'm not sure how it can be implemented, but this is my thought. Should we consider giving certain percentage of admission with financial support scholarship like pre-blocked seats for our Black community in private schools? Would that help to see more Black kids in private schools? Thanks. And it's Prima. It's actually, she's signing up Prima, so they're probably sharing a name here. I have some thoughts about that, but Cindy, I'll obviously let you go first.
I lost you halfway through the question, Kathy.
The question is about would it help to bring more Black children, to give them opportunities in private schools by giving financial and scholarship support?
I think that is one area of consideration, is to be able to provide scholarships for children who need it. And I would imagine, as the world is browner than it was before, that people of color, period, could benefit from that kind of assistance. However, if you don't prepare your environment to receive them well, then you do them a disservice by bringing them in, if I can be so blunt as to say that.
Please be so blunt. And may I be so blunt as to say that we don't want to assume that all children of color need financial support. And I think that that's something that we have to be very, very careful about. We just don't want to go on that assumption. But I do think if your mission base says we want a diverse, inclusive population, then it makes sense to have financial aid and scholarship programs that help to further that end, whether there is a financial need or not. So this is about mission consistent implementation of financial aid and scholarships, which is a whole nother webinar we might do someday.
And Kathy, if I can say something, it is bringing in more children of color and more Black children into your school, considering financial options is one thing, but doing outreach is another. If you want to bring more children of color into your school, then provide access where they are. Because if your form of advertising and marketing is only getting 1% of the population and not the other percentage of the population, then you need to change up your advertising and your marketing to do outreach to that form of that population. So to me, that's an important piece.
Thank you for that. Another question here, Gladys Som. You spoke about looking into holidays to prevent the colonization of education. What key questions can we focus on?
Key questions that we can focus on in looking at the holiday was looking at
holidays, yeah.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, I talked over you. I think she's asking about in assessing what holidays to celebrate or how do we celebrate them.
The first question that I always ask is, what's its origin? And does everyone celebrate this holiday? I don't celebrate anything in my school that isn't across the board and doesn't have an honest origin, and that has knocked out holidays at our school. And so what we create are days where we recognize the earth, where we recognize the seasons, where we recognize each other, and we celebrate that. We celebrate our diversity. And when we did the work looking at holidays, we saw something that was discriminatory all the way around because not everybody did it. And what we allow for is if there is a family that chooses to share some information, and we have a sharing time that a child can share information about what they do in their home, and that is different from the school as an educational institution saying this is how we ought to do it because we present it. And I've also discovered that attempting to say, well, we'll celebrate all of them still discounts what is supposed to happen, because either we don't present it as it should be presented, or we ostracize the children who don't celebrate any holidays.
Yeah, thank you for that insight. I think that will help. That's just really practical tips that people can use. Thank you for that. Let's see, Mercedes asks, Cindy, really appreciate these comments. I see a lot of posts on Facebook about how desegregating their schools will solve their racism problem. That's the wrong place to start. First, schools have to make spaces, which are de facto white spaces, friendly to Black people and people of color. It would be great to compile a list of Montessori school norms that are unfriendly to Black families. So Mercedes, that's a provocative statement, which is not surprising.
Kathy, can you say it again?
Yeah, I will. It would be great to compile a list of Montessori school norms that are unfriendly to Black families. So things that we may be doing without thinking as Montessorians, as our schools, that may not help Black families feel welcome. And we talked about welcoming schools, right? So.
Understood. I think, yes, I think that probably while we were doing that, we could just open that up to people of color in general.
Yeah, she did. She said Black and people of color. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. Yeah. You know, it's interesting. There are such nuances around that kind of stuff. I educate my teachers a lot about not putting their hands on the heads of children, and that in African American families, that is not considered a wonderful thing for people to do that, and that you can make that, you can understand that from another kind of literal. You can do something literal, but consider it figuratively, that when you're doing this, you're pushing someone down. and it just isn't accepted well, but it is an automatic thing that teachers often do. It is also very automatic that people make assumptions about what a child is interested in, what they eat, what they know. I can remember when I first joined a choir that was in I think it was a Baptist church, and all of the other choir members were white, and there was me. And when I came, the choir director said, "Oh, how wonderful, now you can teach us how to sway and how to clap and sway, because we haven't known how to do that." And while it was something that I was able to learn to do and then to teach, I grew up Catholic, and we did not clap and sway. And so it was just, there's so many judgments that people don't quite realize that they make, and that all the way across the board, we have to just work on those kinds of things. And yes, our values and our norms, and how we need to not confuse those by imposing things that are discriminatory and biased in how we see children.
Yeah, John?
To Mercedes' wonderful thought-provoking question, I'm wondering as Montessorians whether we should take a look at, are there things that we're currently doing in grace and courtesy lessons that are biased, that are giving us blinders? As an example, I was talking about this with Cindy the other day. Apparently, there are certain trends in certain Hispanic families where everybody talks at the same time, and it's perfectly fine. So now you have an Hispanic child come into a Montessori school, and he or she is being slammed for talking when other people are talking. It's like, well, but you're not understanding. This is the norm in this child's family. And we still may need to massage this into the culture of the classroom, but how are we approaching that child, with judgment or understanding?
Yeah, and Mercedes gives a couple of examples. She's saying, for instance, the half-day issue for children under 5. There are schools that still use the model that for children under 5, you can only come for a half day, or you have a half day and then you go into a daycare model, and you're not able to have a full day of Montessori and have that family friendly, or being at school by 9 a.m. if that's not a realistic option for families. So she does give some examples, and I'm sure we could come up with a lot more. Not today, because we have limited time left. Karen Diffenderfer, you are here today. Hello. She says, has Cindy studied anything about the deseg orders of Richmond, Virginia school system during the late 60s? I was a student there during this time and watched a massive fight of white families to private schools that sprung up virtually overnight. I left Richmond in the mid 70s, but still wonder what the outcome and if the deseg was ever successful.
Not completely. Not completely. There are still desegregation orders that still sit. They were one of the last, I think after Texas, they were one of the last places to desegregate proms. And there's still some places where in Virginia where they're still trying to desegregate the schools. It is amazing, even though the order sits and has been passed and was passed unanimously by Supreme Court judges. It is amazing to me that it is still allowed to continue.
Yeah, I lived in a community for a very short time, and it will become apparent why it was a very short time, where my children went to a public school for a year. And public school, it was the first year that they were going to have an integrated prom, and this was 1989. First year they were going to have an integrated prom, and the white families held their own separate prom, wouldn't go. They wouldn't let their children go. 1989, we moved out of the area very quickly. They also didn't celebrate Memorial Day, so the children were supposed to go to school on Memorial Day because they didn't really quite believe in that whole thing. So it was an interesting, I had never been exposed to anything like that in my life. I thought I was, in another world, in another country. So it is still happening. Let's see, Valerie Brooks says, this quote was written in 1888. This is the quote. While we endeavor to keep the unity of the spirit in the bonds of peace, we will not, with pen or voice, cease to protest against bigotry. So that just means keep the work up. But it's 1888 they wrote it, right? And we're still doing it. Don't
Right.
put our pens down. Danielle Chaparro says, can you share more examples of how preschools have inadvertently put in place policies that can disenfranchise families? I think, because we have very limited time left today, I think that might be a session, Cindy, that we could look at, or even a piece of a town hall that we might consider. And we'll talk about that
That would be great.
as well. Tim?
Sure.
I just want to remind us that Val Weiss, in her keynote at the Montessori Foundation conference last year, was talking about her interviews of various families of color who chose Montessori and left, and who chose Montessori and stayed, and the ones that didn't choose Montessori. And we have to look at this thing from multiple ways. And I think indeed it would make a great conversation, a workshop in its own self, because there's the whole question of outreach, Cindy, that you bring up, which goes back to so many things that, in our school, we know better of what to do. My mother back in the 1930s was outreaching to the Black community in Washington, D.C. It takes time, it takes energy, it takes a real investment, but it's helping people to feel comfortable making the choice and feeling that they will see people like them there, and that this weird Montessori or this weird non-public school won't mess their kids up. There are a lot of issues that we can unpack there and explore how to make it better. And one thing that you've mentioned, Cindy, in your timeline is that one of the ways to possibly reach out to even more families is that Montessori is a liberation philosophy. We may not have always lived up to our ideal as much as we want, but the fact is that families that chose us usually weren't choosing us to get away from integrated schools. There must have been some schools like that, but usually we tend to draw families that are far more diverse. And I think we can go a lot further in being perceived of as that safe space where everyone really is welcome. Love it.
I have one final question and comment here from Margaret Whitley. I want to make sure, and I think that it's actually a conversation starter, not a finisher, but I'd like to put it out there for us to consider. Margaret says, this has inspired me to search for a deeper understanding, parallel timeline of the history of racism in Canada, and also ensure this is also addressed in any Canadian teacher ed programs. We have a similar history, but also with many differences. I found reading Mara Deb's Diverse Families, Desirable Schools also helped me to better understand the structures we are blind to that make our schools elite and inaccessible and disenfranchise parents and families because of times of meetings, events, etc. And she asks for your thoughts. And I, again, think it's a pretty broad topic, but I so appreciate your thoughtfulness, Margaret. Cindy, any thoughts?
Yeah, I don't remember the name of the book, but there is a wonderful book that I read that talks about the history of Canada and racism in education. And so probably if you just Google that, that's when I discovered how close it was to the United States. It's like, wow, these things are going on at the same time. And how clever, that it all happened at the exact same time.
Yeah, and there's a question here, Gladys what are your thoughts on Hispanic males supported in public school system and schools creating lunch bunch to support them? No others are included in that, not to mention Hispanic girls or other who need that educational support. I struggle with this thought. So I'm not familiar with what that is, that we're singling out Hispanic males in a public school. So
well,
I don't.
I think that we need to look out for children of color and what their needs are. And Latin males who may need the support I think that we should look out for that. In my elementary middle school, we have a large number of Latin children. And so what we do is to ensure that if English is not their first language, we ensure that we're running an extra track, that we're assisting with language, but that we're not having that hold them back from the other things that they can learn, because they just can't. Their mathematics and the sciences are where you can zoom without the same proficiency as others in the English language. And so we make sure that we're focusing on both at the same time, that we're really concentrating on reading, but that we're not holding them back, which is what often happens for Latin males. People assume that if they don't have English, then they are not proficient in anything. And so I think it's just really paying attention, and that might be Latin males, it might be Black males. It just depends on, it might be young girls and the sciences and mathematics. I think that we just need to look and serve children where they need it.
Yeah. Thank you, Cindy, and thank you so much for today. Thank you, Sarah, and thanks to John, Tanya, and Tim for participating with us today. I believe, Cindy, will be doing, I know for sure that we are doing a town hall on Friday at 3 p.m. Dedicated to further study on this topic. Do you want to give us a little bit of a preview of what Friday at 3 p.m. you can pre-register on the Montessori.org website if you are interested in coming to that? Cindy?
Sure. I'm going to present a speech that I gave last night in Marin County in California on the term Black Lives Matter, to understand what in the world that means and why it needs to matter.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. We look forward to Friday. We will see, I'm sure, everybody then. And I, again, appreciate everybody being here. Go to Montessori.org if you'd like to get on our mailing list, find out about other things that we have to offer. If you go to urgent news and announcements, you'll even see calendars, and you can click and have it right on your calendar. So thanks, everybody. Cindy, any final thought?
Oh, and that we're going to talk about white privilege. I forgot.
Oh yeah, white privilege and Black Lives Matter. That's on Friday, 3 o'clock till 4:30 Eastern time. See you all then. Thank you.